I can't move the paper. Hi, friends. I'm sorry, I had to do it. I needed a way to come into today and just lighten the mood and say, hey, mistakes happen. And I'm really sorry for yesterday. If you're trying to find yesterday's work, you'll notice that it's been pulled down and clipped off at 14 minutes. And that is because we're working on fixing yesterday. So I'm ripping up yesterday's PowerPoint. I've already gone ahead and fixed and uploaded a new one. And I recut the video. And I had about an hour and a half long conversation with students on Twitter. And I feel like for the most part have been answering questions that students might have about what is happening with Roe. So, you know, I just, hey, like, let's have fun. It's our last day of full instruction. Oh my God, I'm so excited. I know you are too. All right, let's get going. So we have some things to look at today. You know who I am. Dispensing with formalities. We're old friends by now. We're looking at letter and we're looking at Brown, and we don't really have much time for other things. There's two more things that cover equal protection clause, affirmative action, government action, and pursuance of. I'm going to touch a little bit on those things, but those are for you to pursue on your own because we ran out of time. So let's hold my feet to the fire and let me go back on record and correct where I went wrong yesterday. So we all know Roe is not about equal protection. That's not what it turns on. The discussion had inside, you guessed it, the four corners of that decision are really, really about due process. Due process of the woman, that there is a bar that is put in place by just having a law that says that women cannot have an abortion violates that due process rights that are protected by the 14th Amendment. So a lot of you caught it, which is great. And I saw a lot of you correct me in advance in your responses on the Twitter. So I'm so happy because that means that a lot of you have already heard Roe and a lot of you are at home going, hey, that's not right. Sometimes when the train leaves the station, man, I just cannot get off. Like I'm like, woohoo, let's do this. The 14th Amendment, we definitely should recommend or see here that there are due process concerns that are confounded when we look at women not having the right to make decisions. That's the central premise that we see in that decision with their family and their medical doctor and privacy. So the right to privacy is firmly rooted through the 14th Amendment. I did have some kids who came back and were like, well, does equal protection get in it at all? And I went back and I read Griswold. First of all, Griswold's a really interesting decision. And in the re-record, I spent a little bit more time on Griswold so that it makes a little bit more sense. But there is a discussion of equality, but there's no clear distinction that it's rooted in equal protection. So there's kind of like a blowing glance, right? Like a glance to the side. But for the most part, when you take a look at that decision, it was a 7-2 decision. And the interesting thing is that there were 3 or 4 different interpretations. And when we look at that, that's not a really great precedent. So it's pretty interesting that where the right to privacy comes from was the point of dispute. Some people said it was first, some people said it was this, some people said it was that, but most of them agreed 14th Amendment. And that's where we go into and turn into Roe, right? The precedent in Roe, which we talked about last night in our question. And then of course, that doesn't resolve the fact that the competing prevailing argument that you see from folks who are anti-abortion, who are pro-life, is that it is an equal protection thing because of the extension of the right to life at conception. So I'm glad we got that covered. I'm so glad. All right. We did have a continued conversation then about what is going on with the Ninth Amendment. And it was a very, very interesting conversation that is, I wanted to point that out because I think that when we're talking about what these amendments mean, that when we kind of have this fixed meaning that we condense down to like a brief definition, we are really snipping off some of the nuance that those amendments can mean. And since they're nuanced, since they're complex, when somebody says, well, that's not what that means, it can be so crazy to us because we're like, no, that's, I mean, like in the dictionary, it says that the First Amendment means this, and that's the only thing it can possibly mean. And unfortunately, because again, this was the collective action of not just the 55 founding fathers at the Constitutional Convention, which we, as I said before, didn't know how they felt about stuff until after Madison dies and releases the notes in his estate. The true, and this is something that Madison reinforces, is something you hear from other leading founding fathers, that the true source of interpretation for these, various clauses in the Constitution are the ratifying conventions. And there was not a clear, consensus on any of these rights at all. So they were all debated. They were all had opposing viewpoints. And again, that comes back to that whole point of argumentation, how fantastic it is when we look at the law. It's just so complex. I had this conversation with Faith last night, going back and forth, and a couple other students jumped in on this about why do we even talk about the Ninth Amendment? Why does this get airplay if it's not clear if it's an individual right or a communal right? And the answer is, if you understand that, number one, we just don't have all the information about what everybody thought about the Constitution at that time, and that every time we uncover new information, we now have a new lens that we have to evaluate that through, and it changes the context of conversations. We're like getting some different voices in the chorus, and the tenor of that chorus changes. So we have to go back and reevaluate, and it helps us understand how better to balance these interests, or if we completely reject them, to be able to go back and amend them, right? That's that idea of popular sovereignty that I introduced yesterday with our popular sovereignty language, the Alpha and Omega, the preamble, and then the Ninth and the 10th. So the Ninth Amendment, I did a little bit more digging around. I love going to I love going to law review journals, which a lot of them, once you get onto a college campus, you'll be able to access. But a lot of them, surprisingly, you can find if you just Google law review journal and an amendment or a concept. They're going to be nuancy, so you might need a dictionary. But what I found was interesting, and again, I'm cutting and pasting out of one of these documents that I shared that is on this tweet, is that the author there was talking about, and it was our friend Rusty from Georgetown, who wrote about the Ninth Amendment, and he said it should be stressed that the individual natural rights model doesn't claim the Ninth Amendment to be a source of independent rights, or as Russell Kaplan, another person who has another varied perspective on what that Ninth Amendment precisely means, a cornucopia of undefined federal rights, that they're immune from any government regulation. First, natural rights proceed from the Constitution, and the Ninth Amendment is not their source. Instead, according to this model, the Ninth Amendment refers to these pre-existing rights and requires that all natural rights be protected equally and not disparaged, whether or not they're enumerated. So it's a lot of fancy words. Why does that matter? Well, let's get back to it. Where do rights come from? They come from a maker. We've carved out protections for them. To say that something is sourced in the Ninth Amendment might have made sense at the time in the best light that we had to shine upon something, right? But if we're really trying to fully understand and develop these ideas and what they mean in this balancing act, right? And how we might use them to construct an argument, or to make sure we really understand it. And so that means that, just like you do in your argumentation FRQs, it's about assembling the best evidence and coming up with the most cohesive, consistent, persuasive argument in your commentary to pull that off. And that is, my friends, what law does. My kind of final comment that I shared with Faith is that's one of the reasons why I think the law is so fascinating, is that we have this ability through this collective effort that spans, you know, to 300 and some odd years, right? To something like that, where we are constantly, just through this conversation, allowing there to be entry into that conversation with people who are bringing a different perspective. And so we are able to not only take what was in the past, but as we start to make decisions about who we are collectively as a people and how we want to see ourselves, and we start to bring new voices into the fold, bring new contextualizing information into the fold, it helps us evolve after what I would say is probably a better description of what we are living in, which is an experiment in democracy, right? This is not like democracy is not achieved. We are experimenting, we are pursuing this, and it is unfulfilled. And every single time we allow another voice into the fold and we're bringing in a new way of interpreting something, or we're bringing in new voices from the past, or we're just deciding we reject something in pursuance of whatever we view to be the amazing, sparkly thing about democracy, we're holding true to the promise of what our government system holds for us. So, you know, I mean, let's go, team. Well, getting all, you know, emotional about it. Not just kidding. I don't cry ever. All right. Last night, you guys had this and you guys did a really, great job. I am going to go to sharing screens because I want to see if I can get a good view for this. I have already gone ahead and taken a look at one in advance, and I just want to run through it to show you how fantastic this response was, to really be able to, because I know that some people are at the point where they're like, oh my gosh, I really want to make sure that I have these verbs down, right? So remember, my advice is that we want to first always repeat our prompt, right? And so I went through and I highlighted everything in which I see the structure of the prompt, right? I see a reflection of it. Why is this good? This is good because you are restating what you believe the question is about. And by restating the question, it offers you an opportunity to clarify your thoughts, right? And I'm telling you, I think I've said it a couple of times, but I've seen too many times where students don't repeat the prompt. And because they read that prompt so quickly in those 15 minutes, they miss a couple of important words. So just the act of watching yourself, of holding a pencil or typing on a keyboard and kind of saying to yourself out loud, whatever that prompt is, helps clarify your answer. Yes? Okay. So our informal power, wonderful. Remember, because informal, this was a part of our response here. And that tells us that this is a limiting passage that's going to focus us on a very particular set of powers, not anything under the sun, but informal. So we're looking for things that are out of tradition. And so this student's response here is that, hey, like they could just not hear the case, right? Now, what I love is that this would be an example of if this is the identify, that on itself I would be like, okay, I mean, I know that that is an action. Inaction is important in government. It has, you know, it has huge impact. In addition to that, what I want to say is that I think that that isn't a unique thing that only the courts can do, right? I mean, we're in the ballpark, but it's not quite the tightest of language. So if a kid just had this and then they went on to their, the pink here, which is their explain, or their green, and they didn't really elaborate what this identify was, I would be on the fence about whether or not this was a completed attempt. But they do go on and look what they talk about. Here is where the point is cemented, right? Because this is supposed to be a describe. So they are going on to elaborate, they are describing it, and then their bonus round points, just because they're flexing their way through this to show off, which is beautiful, they're showing me what is the impact of this decision, right? Why does failure to hear a case through the rule of 4 have an effect, right? It's not listening, you won't have the court case come forward. right? Same thing, yellow, nominate justices, concrete action. I love the fact that they went on to clarify, I know exactly what we're talking about here within the Supreme Court. It is a very different statement if you just say nominate justices, because, I mean, let's be honest, if you're in a district court, you aren't going to be deciding anything that has anything to do with appeals and how we understand parts of the law or trying to rectify errors that exist in the law. So, bueno. If the president was to nominate conservative justices, that is our description. The case, here's what happens as a result. It doesn't move forward. So wonderful, beautiful job. Everything is there. I've got 2 task verbs that have been successfully conquered. Moving on, the justice's action in creating legislation, right? Here is an action verb. I can see it's a concrete thing that's happening here affecting the ruling of the court case. I have to jump around here a little bit to find the describe, and that's fine. Sometimes, I mean, like, that's kind of the beauty of writing. Remember, writing is an art, right? But I see what do they mean by this? What are the parts, right? They are going to put riders in their bills, right? And then this could be green or this could be pink. It kind of tells me a little bit about the effect here that it is making it all abortions illegal, which we can see has an impact on the court's ultimate decision. Beautiful. Task verb conquered. Evolving interpretations of the 10th and 14th Amendment, and they are going to give me a spare tire, which is cool, because this is a describe and explain the same thing. It's not describe this thing and then explain to me something else that's related to it. So they are going to give me a spare tire, and that's great. They talk about how would the liberals, which part of the 14th Amendment would liberals turn up, and that would be the 14th Amendment due process clause. Very good. Remember, unpack your rights. Unbox them for me. I want to know what's inside. And then we see the 10th and 14th Amendment. They talk a little bit here. It's unclear what part of the 14th Amendment, but I mean, we know 10th and 14th, and it doesn't matter because this is a spare tire. Even if it's not like crystal clear, perfect, I think it's enough to say 10th and 14th to see that it's connected to making something illegal. If that was in on itself, I might want to know where, but it's sufficient. So beautiful. Some things I want to make sure that we're listening to, because we're going to turn into practice next week, and you're going to have an opportunity to 2 practice tests on Monday and Wednesday with me. Make sure that you are finishing whenever that bell dings, right? At 15 minutes. I know that what we're going to do is we want it to be perfect. You can still score a 5 and not have C finished. All right, that is what I have been told, and that is where I'm going to invest my time and effort. This is about, can you deal with the task verbs and the time, right? If you are doing a good job trying to get through these task verbs, but you get down to the C point and you don't quite turn the corner on the describe and explain, what it's going to be a danger zone here is if you start to run over into the upload time, because 5 minutes is a very short window. And that is the most important thing. You cannot claim to College Board that you need to have a retest if you don't successfully upload your document. So not to stress you out. I know I'm kind of stressing you out, but over the weekend, there are going to be some things that are opening where you can practice and play around. Your teachers might be talking to you about that. Your teachers might be talking to you about how you can prepare. And then next week on Monday and Wednesday, I'm going to release a CA question and an argumentation question. I'm going to be your timekeeper. We're going to do all the things. And then on Tuesday and Thursday, we'll chat about them. And on Friday, we will say arrivederci. All right. So that is that. Let's get back into our conversation, shall we? Of course we should. All right. We are talking about equal protection and in almost an exclusivity today. We talked about it yesterday, especially when we're talking about rights to life issues. So we have an introduction. We talked a little bit about, okay, privilege. We've been circling this drain for a long time. Privilege and music, gift from the states. They're substantive in nature. They're things, right? They're nouns. It's procedural due process and substantive due process. Procedural is like verbs, it's like actions, it's like processes. Substantive is also things. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And then equal protection is this idea that if there's a suspect classification, that you have an ability to be able to advocate for equality before the law. We talked about all of these things at this point. And so here's where, I mean, I'm throwing down acronyms at you. So welcome to alphabet soup time. Here's a crazy thing. Some folks have noticed that procedural due, I don't know why it says DC. It should, a procedural due process clause, right? Procedural due process, it's just a PDP and SDP. Good job. Is action, right? So we've talked about how if you're looking at procedural due process, we're thinking about some kind of action, some kind of process, some kind of sequence of events, something along those lines. And we're like, cool, got it, right? So like as you're approaching the courts, like you should be able to have access to somebody to represent your interests. You should be able to question witnesses. You should be able to know the nature of your crime. All of those things, they're process oriented. Substantive due process, I just told you, is more of like a thing. And I've also told you that so is privileges and immunities. And so why in the world are they different? And the answer is, well, there's this court case way back in the way back when called the Slaughterhouse cases that dealt with Louisiana and some decisions made in the city of Louisiana to try to cut down on communicable diseases that were in the water supply. I believe it was cholera or something along those lines, and folks were dying from them. And so the state decided to make a specific place in which people could work in the slaughterhouse industry, and then they kind of regulated it to the point where they made a determination of who had a job and who didn't. And of course, this is the 1890s, so this is Louisiana, and we're talking about a time period in which you are looking at a job that is going to be attractive to the formerly enslaved, to Black workers, and they were getting boxed out of the positions because there's only so many to go around. And so there was a lawsuit, and anybody else who was involved in this lawsuit could sue as well. And they brought it up under the Privileges and Immunities Clause. They asked if privileges and immunities are going to grant someone the right to a job. That's a thing, right? And the court said unequivocally no, that this is something the states get to define what is a privilege and immunity, and that's left to them. And then that makes it so that they can make determinations about who gets to have what. We haven't overturned this, although there are even people on the Supreme Court, Justice Clarence Thomas being amongst them, who do think that maybe we should. And he brought that up in the concurring argument that he had for it's either McDonald or DC versus Heller, the one that we read earlier, and someone corrected me on it. So now I have source amnesia. But the whole point is that there is this conversation about how that contributes to things being icky about talking about these things, these concepts. And if sometimes you're like, I just don't get it, like the reason why we hasn't been overturned at this point is because it would have such a monumental effect on how we interpret rights and how we interpret case law, and we would have to relitigate a bunch of stuff. And that's where we come back to that idea from our conversation yesterday about the primacy of stare decisis and precedent and why it's so central. And when you depart from stare decisis, it really has to be because there's this just drastic unaddressed error in interpretation. Okay, I mean, like, whatever. All right, so we've got the Warren Court. We're back to this slide. Again, just to think about all of the places where the 14th Amendment walks through the door, whether it be equal protection, whether it be due process rights, whether they be substantive or procedural in nature. This is just an immense amount of things that all turn on one part or multiple clauses within that 14th Amendment. All of these things are both at the same time taking passive terms of declaring actions inoperative, avoiding outlaws, of nullifying actions, and making them far more active in trying to have a different light in which we are going to use to interpret that Constitution. This was a very frustrating component for people who we would traditionally say were conservatives. In addition to that, we should note that in part that reason is because the process of selective incorporation is embedded in so much of this and requires us to take those rights up to a universal national standard, subverting the choice of the community. I mean, it all comes right back around, right? So, I mean, I've been telling you forever that the 14th Amendment is one of the most radical parts of the Constitution. And I hope at this point that you're starting to see why. Like, yeah, there's some weird stuff that's rolling around inside that amendment. And yeah, I mean, it can be confusing. I want to say shout out to the person who reminded me that there's lawyers who get that thing confused. And it's hard. It's really hard. Every time I meet somebody who either it has practiced in in a federal court, or because I live in DC, I have the opportunity and the privilege of meeting enough, and I've had the privilege of meeting lawyers on the federal in the federal circuit, and they also will comment that it's a really tough concept. But if we try to, for the purposes of this course, distill it down into these kind of easier ways, although imperfect, but good, solid generalizations, it might help you. And if we think about those solid generalizations that we have, it helps us breathe life into this consistent drama that we have going on in the background about who should have who has rights, who defines them, what is the role of the national government, what is the role of the state governments, and what is the role of the individual. I mean, we're constantly reevaluating this. And so that brings us back to conversations we had yesterday about application of strict scrutiny tests to ensure that when there's suspect classifications, we're not doing them on ways that are rooted in intentional historical inequalities that are put in place both by fact of law and by fact of tradition and culture. And this starts to, and if you go back and you learn anything, I'm definitely, and I'm going to tell you this to be honest, it breaks my heart that I only have at this point, 20 minutes to talk about the history of minoritized communities in the United States. And really, there are people out there who are constitutional scholars and students of history who say that if you want to know what American democracy, the promise of American democracy is, you should look to minoritized communities and their march for freedom and equality. And I think that it's a pretty fair assessment. I mean, there are some, I am constantly humbled by some of the amazing, just overwhelming sacrifices that are made by Americans in general, but in certain corners of American history, putting one's health and safety on law in the firing line for someone else, and in some cases people you've never met. It's amazing, and it doesn't matter where it comes from, if it comes off the field of battle or if it comes, whether that be in declared war or anywhere else. But I'm digressing and I'm pontificating, so I'm going to stick to the content. Starting in the 1940s, the grip that Jim Crow has on the American South, and I should warn you also that it's not just in a Southern problem. Like, this is something that you see institutions that are reinforcing Jim Crow-like procedures. You see them throughout the United States, and they're going to be reinforced in federal, state, and local law. But we start to see there's more traction in attempting to dismantle some of these structures. And by the 1940s, actions taken by the NAACP and the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, they're going to come at this from two different perspectives. Both of them are going to be primarily through the court system. So the NAACP, we're seeing that is founded by W.E.B. Du Bois, by Ida B. Wells, by Archibald Grimke, by Mary Church Terrell, and white progressives in Illinois trying to help people who are who are in the justice system's jaws, being accused of crimes that they maybe did not commit or are not getting their fair day in justice in the court system, so on and so forth. That's going to spiral out into, far greater reaching network of satellite offices all throughout the country, in which they're not just looking to advocate through the judicial system, but they're also looking to organize and to demonstrate. And the NAACP focuses primarily on economic issues, economic rights under the Equal Protection Clause for Black industrialized workers. They're going to pick other cases too, but if you kind of had to say, well, where are they putting most of their eggs in which basket, it's going to be that. Whereas the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division is going to be pursuing mostly cases in which material harm is going to be placed upon minoritized communities in particular, in this case, Blacks in all over the country through the 13th Amendment. And I know that sounds crazy because we're like, oh, but the 13th Amendment, slavery wasn't a thing. The last time that we had a case in which someone was accused, well, I shouldn't say the last time, but the one that I am the most familiar with actually comes out of the 1920s in Alabama. Where these gentlemen were brought up on federal charges of slavery using the prison and convict leasing program. So it's out there, but that's a whole other story for a different day. If you ever want to know more about that, I've got about 25 books I can point you in the direction of, but we're talking about Brown. So Brown, 5 cases brought before the courts at the same time, all turning on the same thing, equal protection rights in front of the, in terms of education in some way or somehow, some form. And of course, we talked about, we're coming back full circle to Barbara Johns out of Moton High School, that 15-year-old girl who had had enough, and she just organized her community and shone a very bright light with Oliver Hill on the disparity in education in Virginia. We refer to it as Brown v. Board, and that is what you would what we would call this, you know, the kind of the ruling comes in under Brown v. Board, although it catches a lot of the components brought up by the other cases. And the thing here is, and this is for real, it turns on the Equal Protection Clause that we're looking at. The city of Topeka has a policy in which separate but equal doctrine is enforced from Plessy v. Ferguson, and you have a separate high school for Black and white students. Oliver Brown is going to sue on behalf of his 7-year-old daughter with the NAACP, saying it's an inherently unequal system. And we have 4 other cases that are brought up at the same time. And as you guys know, the case, I mean, this is something you hear in US history and here as well. It's rules of segregated schools are inherently unequal, and it harms the students' emotional health and well-being, as well as impacting their ability to provide for themselves in the future. So this is another major flashpoint. I mean, and let's not just let's make sure we come back around to it. This is a Warren Court decision. So we're, you know, this is kind of where the train starts to leave the station. And it is going to also, when we talk about the role that courts play, you are going to see after this that the courts are going to start to get involved in the process of enforcing equal protection in school districts all across the country. And that process is, as you guys can guess, very controversial. So some of our famous quotes that come from this: segregation of white and colored children in public schools has a detrimental effect on the colored children. The impact is greater when it has sanction of law, for the policy of separating the races is usually interpreted as denoting the inferiority of the Negro group. A sense of inferiority affects the motivation of a child to learn. Segregation with the sanction of law, therefore, has a tendency to delay the educational and mental development of Negro children and to deprive them of the benefits that they would receive in a racially integrated school system. So these are, you know, we come back to this whole, this clause that I know everybody knows it. We conclude in the field of public, the doctrine of separate and equal has no place. It's inherently unequal. And therefore, we're going to say that we're going to extend, it deprives people of equal protection of the 14th Amendment. So the question might be, do we just go to the courts to find action on equal protection? And of course, the answer is no. I mean, the 5th section of the 14th Amendment gives Congress, because then this is another really kind of fun thing, no clause in the Constitution is self-enforcing. It takes action of Congress to animate whatever that power might be, right? We don't want, we want to have, writing laws is going to limit the extent to which that power can be. So that's very necessary. And so we are going to animate Congress with the ability to write law, tailoring law to some policy outlet, so on and so forth. And just like every other clause and power within the Constitution, you will see that when there is something like this, that it's required that Congress have that power too. And by extent, that means that each and every single branch is empowered to act within their own constitutional provision of powers. And we know power of the purse, power of the sword, power to interpret, etc. So coming back around to this slide from yesterday, that means that we're going to see the Congress, the president, and the bureaucracy and the courts are going to be actively involved in tending to what equal protection means. And it runs all the way. We talked about all of these things. The only thing that I added on to here that was something that would be new would be equality for women, because there is a discussion about Title IX and is an example of a federal law that allows people, women, to have equal access to funding for college. And I will say that I would like to thank the federal government because I'm a Title IX athlete. I'm a former Title IX athlete. So, it is amazing that we do have these provisions in place because they can be game changing in terms of helping people, that little investment up front, that requirement that a college has equal expenditures for women and men's athletics at this point. It has a rippling effect, right? I mean, it's a compounding effect over time. So very proud of that. And I'm very, that is a lovely story. So why did it take so long for this interpretation to develop? Goes back to, hey, remember, we don't live in a pure democracy. So minoritized groups, the ability for them to petition for political, economic, and civil equality was literally barred through law and custom. And the ability for those groups to be able to pressure nationally and locally would have required the ability to organize, educate, and activate groups. And if you don't have the right to organize, as was not allowed under the system of slavery, under the slave codes, organization, mobility, the ability to move freely between places, association, those were all rights that were not granted to enslaved persons. In addition to that, there's no opportunity. Educating them is illegal. Some of the very behaviors of standing and barring entry into an established place of business would have been seen as hostile and illegal. I mean, there were laws under the Mississippi codes that said that it was illegal to be unemployed. It was illegal to loiter. It was illegal to to move in some places without a reason why. So this does not facilitate this does not facilitate the ability to coalesce pressure in a way that we're more familiar with when you talk about pluralism. So in addition to that, our competing prevailing interests are going to be interested in maintaining their power structure. If we go back in time and we move forward, kind of in either way, and this is actually something that I would say is not in chronological order. We've got some major participatory movements really starting in earnest with the labor movement, and then trickling into women's civil rights and political rights, along with African-American civil and political rights. And then it kind of spirals out from there. So when we talk about or we look to kind of where these movements started to gather steam, remember that all of these are going to be rooted in the targeted group, however we're classifying people, and their ability to mobilize, their ability to associate, their ability to speak freely, their ability to do all of those, which requires that they be seen on even keel in terms of citizenship. So these kinds of things start really in the labor movement and spiral out. And I think that probably makes a little bit more sense if we look at it like that. But by no means is that list comprehensive. This is why I'm like, we need to talk more. I mean, this is like, part of what we might be looking at. Native Americans through organizations like AIM, Occupation of Alcatraz, The Longest Walk, the National Day of Mourning, the litigation they have carried out. Hispanic and Latinx Americans through LULAC and Cesar Chavez, and the LA walkouts and Dreamers, imprisonment of undocumented migrant laborers. Asian Americans with ACE and the Berkeley Biracial Committee, and movements for reparations after Japanese internment, and the LGBT Coalition with Stonewall, and ACT UP and Harvey Milk and PFLAG and Lambda Legal. I mean, it goes on. And I will tell you that if you're looking for the next generation, look no further than yourself, right? The generation that you guys are a part of, there are movements afoot for minors to be able to start to bring to attention issues that are truly, truly important to them as minors. And though the legal rights that minors have require kind of some guidance legally from adults in various different ways, I mean, I think we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the actions of high school students across the country mobilizing for gun restrictions in high schools. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Youth v. Gov and Fridays for Future and all of these different organizations that are really youth-led, that are trying to coalesce around issues that are truly impacting you. So these tactics that we're going to talk about, they get passed on from generation to generation. They get interpreted, they get reinvented, they get remixed, and it is it's a very integral part of democracy. It's the inheritance of that promise and that experiment that we have in democracy. So we're going to shine in the last 10 minutes or so, maybe, a very bright light on complex, dimensional and decentralized movement to bring civil, political, and economic rights to African Americans. We're doing it through the writings of Martin Luther King. Is Martin Luther King the only Black American who had a role in changing, and improving lives of his community? No, but the writings of Martin Luther King, if you have ever had an opportunity, are just absolutely profound. Very, very beautiful, very eloquent. One of my personal favorite books is the book that he wrote just before his death called Where Do We Go From Here? It is amazing, amazing, amazing. It's so good. So he is going to work to place nonviolent civil disobedience as the best way to confront barriers to change, and saw its greatest impact between 1955 and 1965. His work will continue, although it doesn't get as much play because he fell a little bit from, not the limelight, I mean, things splintered in the movement for equality of rights after the passage of the VRA for various reasons, some of them social, some of them political, some of them legal. And there were disagreements within the Black community about how to proceed, just like there were disagreements in the Black community before him. It is a community of individuals who come at it with different perspectives, and they should be seen as individuals instead of an amorphous unified group that has no individuality, right? That makes them invisible. Okay, so why this time period? I mean, this is about 1 billion things that are building up to this. We've got World War I, we've got the Red Summers of 1919, where racial violence was horrific. The Harlem Renaissance is kind of happening at tandem. So you have this community in New York City in which Black intellectuals and Black playwrights and Black writers and musicians, they're all kind of coalescing and being able to create a varied identity, a unique voice, a culture, et cetera, et cetera. You see in tandem, this is going to be with the rise of communism, socialism, and unionism, and red baiting becomes a way of distancing African Americans by saying everything, were some of them communists or were some of them socialists? Yes, but so was everybody else. So, but labeling the entire community as that is a way to cut them off, right? World War II and the confrontation of America's moral crusade against tyranny, it was used by, after World War II, during the Cold War, it was used by the Soviet Union in propaganda. The discussion of conditions of living for Black Americans in the American South and in the rest of the country was used as a way to divide and to put distance between America and the rest of her foreign policy agenda at that time. The Great Migration, this proliferation of movement, partly driven by trying to evade the horrific violence, extra legal violence in the South, and job opportunities up north, et cetera, philosophical tension of violence versus within the civil rights leaders about how to confront violence against minoritized communities, success in lawsuits. We're starting to see the end of white primaries, and so there's some restriction, or there's some loosening in terms of how people get representation, and then just like little bolts of blue, like little bolts of lightning. Things like the Greensboro sit-ins where they were inspired by a sit-in that happened in Oklahoma City from a amazing teacher named Clara Looper, who was also a member of the NAACP, and that was seen as effective, and it was borrowed. Same thing with Rosa Parks' bus boycott. Claudette Colvin was a teenager who refused to move from the bus seat, and this is like a huge thing that does not extra-legal violence was not just, through lynching and beatings and things like that. There was a lot of violence against women within the community, and a lot of that centered through transportation issues throughout the South. And if you're looking for more information about any of this, I might recommend you to go listen to the podcast called Seen on Radio. It is ridiculous. It is so good. And they talk about this. And then, of course, the use of mass media. So long story short, Montgomery bus boycott. King is going to be elevated as spokesperson for this organized group called Montgomery Improvement Plan, working with the NAACP and other African-American groups. And he is going to develop through his own personal beliefs, through his education as a pastor in the clergy, that he, and talking to people like Mahatma Gandhi. He spent time in India talking to Mahatma Gandhi with his wife, Coretta Scott King, and they would forward, really like put this forward, that if you wanted to work with the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, that you needed to be committed to nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience. And it was successful in Montgomery. It took a year and a month to be able to be successful. It took great sacrifice by the African Americans in that community. It ended in a court case that terminated segregated busing. And so King and his community are going to take this show on the road. And so they actually will attempt to do the same thing in Albany, Georgia for about a year, but it doesn't go as well, and for a large variety of reasons, which I wish I had time to go into. But kind of coming out of the inability to do well in Albany, there was some violence against women happening on the college campus, that's there in Albany, Georgia. What King looks for is another place, and he is going to be welcomed by Reverend Shuttlesworth to come to Birmingham. And Birmingham had a nickname. It was called Bombingham. It had a 60%, it is this growing city. It's found in a place where there is mining happening there, aluminum and other kinds of mining. And so this is this just huge industrialized city that has a huge demand for human capital. People will go, but it's very difficult, as you can imagine, for Black workers to get jobs that are skilled labor, to be in the labor unions, to do anything of meaning. And in addition to that, there is a crime wave against the Black community. We're talking about just before King arrives there had been 50 unsolved drive-by bombings in a community called Dynamite Hill, which is where it was a segregated Black community, and it was a way of the KKK keeping anyone who kind of got out of line, who was agitating, asking for rights, asking for jobs, asking for anything, to keep them in place through the threat of violence. And it was condoned by the police force. Bull Connor was the police chief. He kind of just turned an eye to it and engaged in some very crude ways of policing. So they're going to show up and they want to replicate economic pressure in Birmingham. It is at the same time, there's an election in November of 1962 for city government. Bull Connor and the outgoing government does not want to step down. A more moderate, less segregationist government was elected. So what's happening at this time is that in this contested space, There are two governments running the city at the same time, which is wild, and it's Easter weekend. And so what King wants to do is he wants to put economic pressure. He wants to put a boycott in place. He wants to, picket outside of white businesses and just prevent there from being any engagement in commerce on the second busiest shopping period of the year. And so this happens from April 3rd to the date of his arrest on April 12th of 1963. And this is a picture of him walking before his arrest on that day. So we should note that King is influenced by letters from the Apostle Paul, from Mahatma Gandhi, from Henry David Thoreau, from other sources that are espousing resisting evil systems and disobeying unjust laws. And he is willingly welcoming arrest at the hands of a tyrannical government. It is a part of understanding how to call attention to this issue. He needed to go to Birmingham because he needed a foil. He needed someone who was the exact opposite, who was tyrannical and arbitrary and violent and harmful to rights. And so he will arrive the city of Birmingham, including the commissioner, Bull Connor, who has a contested election, is going to advocate to have an injunction put in place to prevent King and his other protesters from assembling. They appeal and they are unsuccessful at getting the injunction lifted, and so he is arrested. And on that very same day, he is going to receive a letter from 8 members of the Birmingham clergy. They're white pastors, white ministers, so on and so forth. And this is something that King has been waiting for. He's been waiting for an opportunity to create an environment where he can write a response to why he is engaging in this. And so this letter that comes from our ministers is going to highlight why they're critical. So they're saying things like, you're an outsider, you shouldn't be here. This is unwise and untimely, but we just have a new election. Why don't you give us time for us to negotiate? Think pluralism here, right? Find proper channels, meaning like, let's have a meeting, let's negotiate, let's sit down with the courts, et cetera, et cetera. And you are doing things that are inciting violence. And so these are extreme measures and we don't want them in our community. All of these things, right? Which of the democratic theories are being pushed here? I mean, it really depends. It's definitely not participatory. One could say maybe pluralist, right? They're saying, no, like, let's use traditional ways of negotiating. But they're also in control. So we could maybe say that kind of elitist, I don't know, right? But for the most part, we'll label kind of what the white community is looking for as pluralism. What King is looking for is participatory, right? He wants these actions where individuals are speaking for themselves and advocating. So he has his network comes in to visit him, and he's writing this letter furiously over a period of 8 days, and it's on scrap papers or smuggling it out. It's assembled, and it's not sent back to the ministers. It's an open letter sent to press agencies all over, including the New York Times. And it's also a play on this folk ballad about being incarcerated in Birmingham jail that has been recorded by people like Otis Redding and Pete Seeger and other American artists. So he, right off the bat, he's going to say, I have a right to be here, right? Here I am the president of an organization. And that's a pretty bold move to make, because I want to remind you that that is not only putting his neck on the line, but it's stating that they have a constitutional right. It's implied here that they have a constitutional right to assembly and to speech. And so he is going to come back around in the most ultimate shaming I've ever seen and say, by the way, you know that thing that you guys are all like, we're all in the same club about, like the Bible? Like, I am just like the Apostle Paul, going around and bringing the gospel of Jesus to the Greco-Roman world and then writing from jail. Wow. So Birmingham, let's do parallel here. We have an opportunity for new and constructive, realistic approach. And he comes back and says, we tried that. It sucked. It was bad, right? In any nonviolent campaign, we've got 4 steps. We tried to negotiate. We tried to collect facts. We tried to present them. We did self-purification, and now we're in direct action. And we have had good faith negotiation, and it failed. Then they say, this is unwise. This is untimely. I mean, It's amazing to me that they are saying you should wait another year when for 340 years, no access to power has been meaningfully rendered in the South. And so with the exception of Reconstruction, he comes and he says, what I'm waiting for, what, like, when is there going to be a good time, right? It's almost never. And in addition to that, they ask this question of, under what grounds is it okay for you to engage in breaking the law when you're telling us that we have to abide by the Brown v. Board decision, which, remember, that Brown v. Board decision flies in the face of the community. And he makes this really great comment here that you should pause and read, but I'm going to summarize it. It's about justice, and it's about what constitutes a just law. Remember how we talked about good governance? It's in this document, right? If it's an unjust law, guess what? We don't have to follow it. So this nonviolent direct action, he welcomes that tension. In a way, he's saying, I need to be arrested to bring a highlight to this. And then he says, you better find, you need to find the, make sure that it's just us. And he says, but where there's injustice to one, there's injustice to all. And he believes that it's important to be involved in this. And this extreme measures, there's this really interesting passage about what is extreme when he is trying to both straddle components of the Black community that don't want to do anything because they don't want to disrupt things, versus individuals in the Black community who are espousing violence in response to centuries of being put under the heel of those in power. So what happens as a result? I mean, there's a lot of stuff, right? Nothing really happens in the short term. The injunction is never relieved. They continue organizing. They have this thing in the summer called the Children's Crusade. Bull Connor uses water cannons and police dogs and physical violence, arresting minors. It causes riots. It's turmoil. September 15, 1963, sticks of dynamite are planted on the external foundation of 16th Street Baptist Church of the KKK by the KKK, and it kills 4 13 and 14-year-old girls. So impact, what does this matter? He's a policy entrepreneur. What happens as a direct result, not just only in Birmingham, but later next year in Selma? Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act are passed, right? Is it successful? Would we say his dream has been fulfilled? And I would tell you, I don't think that, I know that King did not see his dream fulfilled. He knew it wasn't fulfilled. He knew that he was passing on the baton to someone else, even on the edge of his untimely assassination in 1968 is something that he referenced, knowing that he would get to the promised land and that everyone else would show up at some point in time. So what does this all bring back to us? And that is that this is that tension between our identities of, are we of the collective? Are we of the national? Are we of the individual? And where does the Constitution turn in defining these rights? And a lot of it has to do with what happens once we add the 14th Amendment to the equation. I didn't know if I was going to be able to get to it. All right, Brown v. Board, we all know 14th Amendment and Jim Crow laws were outlawed by the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. We did it. It's a miracle, miracle of miracles. Here is your homework. Shout it back at me on the Twitter. I'm going to say, guys, I know I'm with you next week, but this is my last day of instruction of content. I'm sorry that I went over, but this is one of those things where I could talk to you about this forever for reasons I already stated. I hope that you have learned something valuable today, and that this is, and every day has been a good investment in your time. And I appreciate you walking through this place and space with me and watching me be a real person and do my best, and sometimes make mistakes, but come back and say, like, here's what I got wrong, but these are all the things we got right. So I wish you the best of luck, and I hope that you join me next week. And until then, have a great weekend. Bye, guys.